Gripple House. And the building itself has changed forms over the years, and the women have changed forms too, but they're still in there. Because you go in, you hear them, but also employees said that if they go in after hours, you'll see Maggie Hunter oftentimes as this full-bodied figure in a pale dress, and sometimes she'll appear running, screaming at you and chase you from the ground, so she doesn't like you. And actually, Dr. Gauss and I, we did an investigation inside there, and they warned us that we might see her, but what they didn't warn us was that there is another way that Maggie Hunter in particular likes to interact with the guests inside that building. You see, if you don't say hello and goodbye to Maggie when you enter and exit the building, she turns the alarms on you. And that has happened for years. And so Dr. Gauss and I had to very sheepishly explain to the police exactly why we definitely were allowed to be in there. However, they bought it eventually. The only problem is her story is a little bit dark, and we don't get much brighter tonight. Because it's hard to talk about ghosts without talking about death. And in Savannah, that means talking about war, and disease, and slavery, and fire. Because right now, we're headed towards the Savannah Theater, and it's shockingly not a particularly beautiful building. And that's shocking because they've had about 3 tries to get it right, because it's burned down so many times. But in the 1820s, it burned down in a way we think left one particular woman behind by the name of Betty. Because we think of her as, when she was alive, she was a famous opera singer. Folks would come from all around just to hear her sing. However, back in those days, they didn't have modern lights. They had to light the stage with actual fire, with candles and the footlights. And so she was so famous, she had this private dressing room underneath the stage. And one day, she was underneath the stage, and then someone accidentally kicked over one of the footlights, the candles, and the entire building went up in smoke. She burned alive in her dressing room. But even to this day, you still hear her. Because the folks that go inside, especially when the entire building's been cleared out right before a performance, you still hear her voice singing up and down the scales, even when there are no performers. And in fact, let this be one lesson to any prospective ghost hunters among you all. And also, if you want to write this down, go ahead. There will be a quiz at the end. Because a ghost doesn't have to be something simple like seeing things or hearing things. It could be a little bit more abstract. As the owner of the building, for a performance one night, and he opened up that trap door to go down to the dressing room in that building right over there, the Savannah Theater. He said the second he opened up the trap door, he saw in the middle of the dressing room this 2-foot diameter fire burning a hole in the ground. He said, "No." And then the fire burned. Nothing left but the scorch mark on the ground. And so who knows? Maybe that's obviously has a lot of experience with fire. So who knows? But we still think she's in there. Though we don't think she's alone. Because let this be a second lesson, that we think there's another kind of ghost in there. A transient ghost, we like to say, of a little boy named Ben. And there's no evidence of that station down the street. But I had to guess Wright Square. And Wright Square used to have another name, because we used to call it Hanging Square. So let me take you way back in time to about 1733. That was when Savannah was founded. And there were these 3 folks. There was Alice Riley, Richard White, and William Wise. And Alice and Richard, they were indentured servants from Ireland, and they came over under the purview of William Wise. And it turned out they quickly discovered William ugly and cruel. And he forced them to do these demeaning tasks. Like he had this long shock of gray hair, it came down to his waist. They were forced to comb out his hair. They had to pick food out of his beard. And also Alice was forced to warm his bed whenever he had inclination, because she was very young, very beautiful. And eventually she fell pregnant to William, and that made Alice and Richard very mad. Obviously so. Rage grew and grew and grew until one day they decided to lure William into the bath, just like normal, and then they crept up behind him, They grabbed his hair, started to wrap it around his throat while Alice took his head and dunked it in the bathwater, and they both held him there just long enough for that to become the first murder of Savannah. And then they ran. But they wouldn't, well, I wouldn't be telling you the story at Hanging Square if they got away with it now, would I? Because they were brought right back here. And Richard, he hung here for about 3 full days before they cut him down. Although Alice, when it was discovered that she was with child, that she was pregnant, the judge right over here in the municipal building said, oh, we're not going to be barbarians. We're going to kill you after your child was born. And so 9 months later, it was ripped from her. She was brought right back to the square. And right before she was executed, she uttered this one last curse into the air. And it's a curse I don't repeat for a few reasons. One is that I don't speak Gaelic. But the second is that apparently it was so strong that she's still here in the square, and these people go by and they see this woman dressed in ragged old clothes run up to them and say, my baby, have you seen my baby? Before she just wanders off. Although another first-hand account of a mother going down this street apparently was attacked by this woman in the same clothes, screaming and threatening to take their own child away from them before running in the night like a lunatic. And so I always like to say there's easier ghosts to find than Alice. And the best thing about Savannah is that you don't have to go very far to find the next set of ghosts, because right here we have the Marshall House. Any of you staying at the Marshall House? Good, because it's incredibly haunted. In fact, I'd like to point out the floors right through those windows. You see, this building used to be a hospital during the Civil War. The only problem is there was one winter, it was so cold, they couldn't bury the bodies. And so some of the doctors got the fine idea of taking the severed limbs of the amputees and putting it underneath those floorboards, with the promise that once the war was over, they would probably return the bodies and go about their days. The only problem is, it wasn't until the year 1999 where they were renovating those floors, and they thought that there was a serial killer on the loose. Those police stayed all up and down Broughton Street, and it wasn't until the car came back that they realized what had happened. And the headlines in town said, corpses found underneath the Marshall House. They only found bags of arms and legs, but that did spark the debate of exactly how much of a dead body do you eat. And they're still in there, in some ways. Every few years, the folks that stay there say that they see this man shambling down the hall with his own severed arm clutched in front of him saying, please, can you find me a surgeon? I need my arm back! Before he just collapses down the floor, and folks either run away screaming back to their rooms or to get help. One way or another, when they come back, no one's there. But there's also a stench inside the Marshall House. In fact, I've had guests on board my Charlie say that they smelled this rotting flesh smell, the scent, and it smelled very sulfurous, they said. And that's been springing up inside the Marshall House for years, even after the bodies were removed. Although, there is another thing that can make a stench in this town, and it's not just the tourists. Because right now we're actually headed towards the Hampton Lilliebridge House. And long story short, on some of the less important history to get to the good stuff, it was built by Mr. Hampton Lilliebridge and his wife to model their Rhode Island home. But when the Mr. died, the widow turned it into a boarding home for sailors. And then one day, one of the sailors, he was all packed up, he was all ready to go across to another voyage across the seas. And then he went up to the second-story bathroom and then hung himself up there. And all of his friends, all of his crewmates said that they could not understand it. It was so unlike him that he must have been possessed, they said. And some folks don't believe in possession, though I'll go ahead and say right now that my mentor, Dr. Gauss, certainly does. He's actually a priest. And he actually thinks that that wasn't the last time the house was going to draw blood, because in the 1960s it was bought by Mr. Jim Williams, which is a name some of you might recognize from Midnight at the Garden of Good and Evil. That was a story based off of his life. However, he was big in historic preservation, and he actually had some workers renovating the place. And one day, one of his workers went up to that very same bathroom on the second floor, and then his friends heard this slam come from up there. They ran up and they saw their friend hitting his head against the tile floor, screaming his head off and clawing at the walls. And when they finally restrained him, he said that he felt possessed by this force that he couldn't see. and then he died of brain damage 3 days later. However, he was so scared that, first of all, the Hampton Lilliebridge House is this middle building right over here, and we're going to go around the back side to get a closer look at it. But Mr. Williams was very terrified, and yet he still tried to live in the house for about a week. But he said that he was run from the grounds by a 7-foot-tall demonic entity. This figure that would stand at the foot of his bed, whose footsteps sounded like breaking glass underneath its feet. And he was so scared, he got a local Episcopalian priest to do an exorcism on the place, which is why we call that building the site of the first failed exorcism of Savannah. Because apparently it came back 3 days later with a vengeance, ran him from the grounds, and he never went back. His house is on the other side of Savannah. Although it's still in there, the folks that go inside that building, I've had folks show me their pictures that they've taken, and they love to take pictures in that bathroom. And they'll show me pictures of the mirror, and there'll be nothing, 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 and then they'll show me a picture of a dark silhouette staring right down the barrel of the camera inside the mirror. So I recommend staying away from the Hampton Lilliebridge House myself. Although if you do decide to go in, I recommend bringing holy water. That's what Dr. Gauss says is the main weapon against a demonic entity. So if you ever need some, just go to him. He'll get you some. And sadly, you might need to know this information, because in our line of work, we open up a lot of portals. Which brings us to another good lesson for any ghost hunter. Portals, what are they? How do you open one? More importantly, how do you close one? And simplest explanation, a portal is simply a doorway, a thinning of the veil that something can pass through, be it ghost, spirit, demon, who knows. Although it can be opened something like with a seance, or if you're a teenager, a Ouija board. Or it could be something simple like a mirror that used to be owned by someone who's now a spirit. But if you open one, you always have to close it by saying goodbye. Although if something's on this side, it might be a little bit more resistant to being closed. You may have to push them back first. But if you want something to stay on the other side, I recommend you take a lesson from this building right here, because this is the Pirate's House. And I'd like to point out the blue on the shutters, because that is paint blue. That comes from the Gullah Geechee people, and they were the descendants of slaves that were working on the cotton and rice plantations from Florida all the way through the Carolinas. But paint blue was said to ward away spirits, and it would burn them to the touch if they were ever to come in contact. And because it looks like running water, ghosts would simply pass over it and try to find somewhere else to haunt. The only problem is, Dr. Gauss and I believe that that building is incredibly haunted, because the blue is not keeping the ghosts out, it's keeping the ghosts in and under the building, because the Pirate's House is called the Pirate's House for a reason. Privateers would go there in the 1700s because they needed crewmen. They would go up to the sailors in there and do one of three things. They would either get them really drunk, or they would drug them, or they would use a home remedy, which was a dosage of 1 chair applied topically to forehead to render them unconscious. And they had a tunnel that stretches right underneath the rum cellar of the Pirate's House, underneath this little section of Savannah. They would exit on the river. The pirates would bring the unconscious sailors through to where their ship would be waiting, and they would shanghai you, force you to work on the boat. The only problem is sometimes the sailors would wake up midway being kidnapped, and they'd fight back, and maybe the sailor or the privateer or both would end up dead inside the tunnel. And if you've ever been down to River Chute to see the Waving Girl statue, if you look not towards the water but towards the land, there's a pipe. That's pretty easy to miss because it looks like a storm drain, but really it's for air, because the other end of the pipe sticks straight into the tunnel, which is still right over there. And Dr. Gauss had me go up to that pipe with a spirit box. And a spirit box is essentially an FM radio that constantly cycles through channels of dead air. And because the dead, they exist on a different frequency than us, sometimes they speak through a spirit box. And I held it up to that pipe, and it sounded like there was a fight, like swords scraping across stone and people yelling and arguing. Unfortunately, they're not the only ghosts on this street, because all across here, these buildings on Bay Street, these used to be warehouses. And unfortunately, a lot of them were where slaves were bought. and sold and forced to work and lived all along these buildings. I've actually had guests on board say that they were staying in some of these hotels, heard the sounds of moans or screaming or the sounds of rattling. So other folks have said that they'll be going along Factor's Walk and they'll see people in the road. We're about to be headed towards Abe's on Lincoln. It's a pretty popular dive bar, I would know. I'm a ghost guide, I know my spirits. However, there are a set of footsteps that go up and down this street right here. That's Abe's on Lincoln with the lights right over there. But there are these footsteps that will follow you down the street. And if you turn around, sometimes they'll stop and you keep on walking. They'll follow you. You stop and turn around. They stop and they're just not there. Some folks have actually said that you'll be walking, you'll hear the footsteps. They turn around and they heard the footsteps go right between their legs and keep on walking down the River Street. But the reason we think those footsteps are here goes back to one Savannah man who had a nightly ritual. Every night he would go down this street, grab a pint with his friends at Abe's on Lincoln, and then go down to River Street. Until one day he met a man named Gary Ray Bowles, who was a serial killer, who lured him away and then bludgeoned him to death and then stuffed his neck and throat with leaves and dirt and then left him behind a barn to rot. And so we think maybe those footsteps are him walking down the street. Although maybe it could be Gary Ray Bowles because he died in prison just a few years ago. And you really don't have to take my word for practically any of the stories that I tell on board, because if you want to know who discovered and who experienced this particular ghost firsthand, that would be Radar. It was a very interesting phone call I got after work one night, hearing about all the footsteps behind you. Although you heard the ones that the footsteps stopped, yeah?
I think they were the serial killer because I was walking and I heard footsteps following me and I turned behind me and there really was nowhere for them to hide because it was just a building. Mm-hmm. And I started walking again and heard the footsteps, turn around again, nobody's there. And then I went to cross into Warren Square and the footsteps basically disappeared. And so I had called him, I was like, I heard the footsteps, but they weren't doing what you say they normally do. Mm-hmm. And so when he looked to see if he had been executed, he was executed in 2019.
That Gary
it felt bad. It didn't feel like the local one. It felt like a bad person.
A bad energy? Yes. And so really, you don't have to take my word for practically any of these stories. Although you will actually have to take my word for the next one. But I do have a little bit of evidence to back it up. Because if you'd like for some show and tell, if you want to take a look at this, this is a photograph that I, myself, took in this building right here. Because, you see, it was me and Dr. Gaust. We were investigating this building. They cleared it out just for us to do a paranormal investigation. We were headed up towards the Haint Blue attic when we got to the second story, and we saw this little boy at the end of the hallway. And I tried to say hello. Dr. Gauss said hi. I snapped that photograph, and then the little boy looked at us, waved, and then walked straight through a wall. And so when Dr. Gauss did the research later, he realized that the wall that little boy walked through used to be a doorway before the building was renovated. So we always like to say that if you see a ghost walk through walls, check the history of the building. We think that little boy was just walking down the halls that he was used to during life. Although we think he's there for a very sad reason, because a lot of the victims of the yellow fever were kept inside there. And it was a nasty way to go, the yellow fever. In 1820, we had a very nasty outbreak of it. And it didn't start like you might expect, because it started with a fire. About 3/4 of Savannah was burnt to a crisp overnight. And then after the fire came the flood, and all these raised basements you see around town were filled with stagnant water, which bred mosquitoes. And if they got to you, then you would contract the disease, and eventually you'd be brought right over here to Colonial Park Cemetery. See, the folks inside these buildings, they'll look out at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, and they'll see that they watch people crawl from one mausoleum to the next, or that they'll see people dancing between the headstones, or that they'll hear this sad funeral dirge in the air. And if there was anything that could make me come back as a ghost, it would be a death as heinous as the yellow fever. You'd start to bleed from your eyes and your ears and cough up black blood that looked like coffee grounds. Although there are maybe a few other reasons why this place is haunted, because, quick show of hands, how many of you have not been inside the cemetery yet? Okay, well, nearly all of you. Congratulations, you are now inside the cemetery, because that fence used to be on that side of the street. They moved the fences and the headstones, not the bodies that we're driving over right now. And I'd also like to point out the pattern stamped on the bricks right out there. Much like Hate Blue, the Savanians believed that that pattern would ward away spirits, but not to keep the ghosts out, to keep the ghosts in and under the road. And unfortunately, defiling graves is a bit of a habit that we have here in Savannah, because if you go inside there, you might notice some very strange headstones. For instance, one of a woman that died before she was born, or one of a little girl that died at the age of 3, but left a 25-year-old son. Or apparently one of a man who was scheduled to die in 2138. We'll see if that pans out. But the reason we have so many strange ones, we think goes back to the Civil War, because that's where General Sherman housed his cavalry. And turns out, folks in the Army, especially when they were teenagers, like they were, when they had just a little bit too much free time on their hands, decided to take some creative license with the headstones, chipping away at the names and dates and changing them. And so, unfortunately, that's not even the first time that that graveyard or Savannah itself had defiled graveyards, because all of this, all the way down to the river, this used to be Yamacraw Bluff. This is where the Yamacraw Native Americans lived and died. After the Europeans got here, mostly where they died. This was their sacred ground. Now it's a sacred parking deck. Can't exactly imagine that pleases the ghosts that are still around here, and especially the Yamacraw, because they actually had a very firm belief that you remained with your bones and your sacred burial objects. And they had two main burial grounds, one underneath Chippewa Square, where the Savannah Theater is, and the other was buried underneath Wright Square, Hanging Square. And he actually had a monument built in his honor there, a Ballaststone Pyramid. But it only lasted about 100 years before it was just dilapidated and forgotten. And then a man named William Washington Gordon had a very bad day, meaning he died. And then they put his monument over the chief's body. They didn't move the chief's bones, they just put someone else's monument over his body. And so if you want to know why Savannah seems to be so haunted, you have to realize that every single building around here has laid claim to one or part of one corpse underneath its foundations. And some people actually don't believe me when I say that. But I'll bet we have some Southerners on board. How many of you guys remember Hurricane Matthew, perhaps? Oh yeah, Hurricane Matthew stormed through Savannah. They tore up a lot of trees. And originally the Savannahans were just going to chop them up, remove them quick as you please. But then tape sprung up around them, and they revealed they couldn't remove the trees because in the upturned roots they found bones, and a lot of them. And they weren't trees in a square or a cemetery. They were trees in the medians along Liberty Street and Oglethorpe Street. So if we happen to have hit an unexpected bump in the road tonight, just know that that's likely a middle finger from 6 feet under. Because believe me, it might only be a middle finger, considering right now we're headed towards the redoubt, the Spring Hill Redoubt, right at the corner here. This is the monument to the Siege of Savannah. It was the second bloodiest battle of the American Revolution. The only problem is, back in those days, if you got shot, the typical remedy for a gunshot wound in your arms or your legs was to just cut it off, amputate it, prevent the gangrene from spreading. But it turns out if you have a big wheelbarrow of severed feet, you're not going to give that its own gravestone, now are you? And so they just brought it out to the edge of town and dumped it. And we built straight on top of them ever since. The only problem is those are the undocumented pieces of corpses, but we do have undocumented whole corpses all through here. Because this is the Savannah Swamp right in front of us. And unfortunately, a lot of the slaves, they didn't always get their own grave site or their own burial ground. They were just dumped wherever was. Were the Gullah Geechee people, as I mentioned them earlier, descended
West Africans. They were forced to work through Florida, through the Carolinas, on rice fields and cotton plantations, and they brought their culture with them. They brought all sorts of arts and crafts and song and dance. But what concerns us are their demons, because they had one creature they called the Plat Eye, or the Eye of the Plantation. It was apparently this shape-shifting monster that would try to stalk and find lone victims in rice fields, and it would either come to you in the form of an animal or a trusted friend. However, you would always be able to know that it was the Plat Eye because it only had a single solitary eye on its forehead. But if you ever looked into its eye, it looked back, and it would steal all of your memories. And as we are passing by this area that used to be the swamps and rice fields, I am reminded that we are actually very close to the Savannah Underground, which brings me to the pop quiz section of tonight. Don't worry, I'm not actually going to quiz your memory. That would actually be very cruel. The pop quiz only has one question, and that is, how many of you ever experienced sleep paralysis before? Really? Really? The two of you? Well, congratulations! You may have been haunted by one of the Gullah Geechee spirits known as the Hag, or the Boo Hag. It was apparently a creature that would stalk through the night, find you where you slept inside your home, jump on your chest, and paralyze you, and then suck out all the energy that you just earned from sleeping. And so if you've ever had sleep paralysis, and maybe if you felt a weight on your chest when it happened, then that may very well be the Hag that found you and sucked out all your energy. Who knows? The only thing is, the Gullah Geechee, they needed ways to defend themselves against these spirits. And as we are pulling up to the Savannah Underground right now, allow me to leave you with just one or two final parting words of wisdom and advice. They had to defend themselves against these spirits, and so, if you could, sir, hold up that broom. You might notice, paint blue handle. That is not a decoration or a mere broom, that is a weapon that they would use. They would either use it as a brand against the spirits, or they would lay it at the threshold of their home, and that would prevent the spirit from entering. Alternatively, they would use things like a silver dollar tied around their ankle to ward away the spirits, or they would paint blue across the ceilings. Give me the broom.
I think that's just a backfire.
A backfire.
I mean, it came from the engine.
Did it? Come on, you see it?
The engine's in the front. Oh, I'm wrong.
What is it? What is it?
Okay.
Okay, nobody move. Don't let it touch you. Under no circumstances let it touch you. This is the Hag. Get off my trolley, spirit. You are not welcome here. Get off of my trolley. I said, get out of my trolley. Back to hell and back to this wall. I do not care. Get off my trolley. All right, did it touch you? Did it touch any of you? Okay, good. Once it gets a taste, sometimes it comes back for more. Just punch it, Radar.
Is it out of the way?
Don't worry if it's out of the way. Don't mind running it over.
If I run it over, I'll have to clean the trolley.
I'll clean the trolley. I've got the broom. All right. Well, I recommend you keep those nerves of steel with you as you go inside the Savannah Underground right here. Although, if there is anything that you would like to leave behind on the trolley, go right ahead. It will be here when you get back. If you don't get back, it's Radar's. And also, I do recommend if you're wearing a lot of layers, you may want to shed one or two because it does get a little bit warm on the inside. There we are. And if you are ready for the Savannah Underground, just follow me up that little ramp right there, and then we'll get you comfortably situated. And Dr. Gaust, they'll be with you very shortly. Right this way, folks.
Have fun. Hope to see you later.
Okay, guys.
Come on in.
Merrick.
Eric?
Merrick with that. M-E-R-R-I-C-T. Oh.
Yeah, we're not in line.
We're not in
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, Vince Rosales is going to be with you folks in just a few moments, but in the meantime, good luck.
It's like old. Like the building might be old. Yeah, I didn't know it would be it like that. Like all them different places. I didn't know it would be it like that. We don't come down here. Right. Oh, right. It is. I didn't know it was so much. Under every house, there are bones, bodies buried under every house. Every house. I can't get over that. Every house has corpse or limbs. They moved the tombstone, but they didn't move the bodies. That's some poltergeist shit. They just living there and built on top of it. That's poltergeist. Your baby get to slide through the kitchen, you wonder why. His body's up on the house. It's poltergeist, I'm telling you. That is poltergeist, that is crazy. Oh, goodness. I know, right? I know, don't do that. Hey. Why that sound like that Halloween? It's that Halloween music. He finna pop up out of somewhere. Right. You get grabbed. It's just a curtain. Go grab it. You're like, rah. Okay, guys, so we're supposed to start the second part of the tour. So I'm basically gonna turn my camera around so you guys can see what I see. So we waiting on the second part of the tour to start, guys. This is where the show part's supposed to go on. It's supposed to be interactive. So I may need my hands. We're gonna figure this shit out though. Alright, so I'm gonna turn my camera around. Alright. So they built on top of the bodies. So they built on top of the bodies. They moved the headstones, they moved the tombstones, but they didn't move the bodies. And they built on top of the bodies. Food for thought.
Alrighty, if I can get everybody's attention, I'm going to play a short video on the screen for you in just a few moments. We're just waiting on a few other people to get here. I wanted to know if we have a party in here for Hawkins, Eric.
Eric, yes.
Eric, okay.
Last name starts with K?
Yes.
Deal.
And then we have Caroline, 2 tickets for Caroline McPhee. Alrighty. I'll check you guys in. And then do we have Carrie Inks? Carrie, no Freddie Perry? Okay. Yep, so we're going to hold for a few minutes, let the rest of them trickle in, and then I will show you guys something on the screen explaining our house rules for tonight. What are y'all's names? All right. All right, you guys can come up here so I can put you guys in. Were you guys playing this one? Did you just okay, so you don't pick some of it? All right, if I can get everybody to turn your attention to the screen, I'm going to play a short video explaining our house rules for tonight.
Good evening. Thank you for coming to the Savannah Underground. My name is Kewan Drake and I am the co-owner. We are glad that you're here tonight at our location at 415 West Boundary Street.
Hello, my name is Kristen Osborne and I'm the stage manager for the Savannah Underground. We wanted to let you know that there will be strobing lights and flashing lights throughout the show tonight, so if you have any sort of seizure disorder or epilepsy, please let us know at the front desk.
Hey there, my name is John Taylor Timmons and I am the writer-director of the Savannah Underground. I just wanted to personally thank you all for coming out to see this show. We've worked really, really hard on it as a team. You will be receiving props during the show and we ask that you please return them before you exit. Now, if you don't want to carry anything throughout the show, we will be happy to keep it behind the counter. It will be safe up there, we promise.
If you're tired or you find that you would like to take a seat during the show, there are seats available throughout the house for your pleasure. And remember, our intention is to scare you, not to make any sort of physical contact with you. Any incidental contact is just that, incidental, and no actors will touch you willingly throughout the show.
As many of you may know, it's 2021 and reviews are king. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review on Google or TripAdvisor.
All right, everybody have a like to leave at the front desk while they enjoy the show. All right. All that we ask is that you don't take any photography or video of any kind until we get started from right here.